seeking you as a precious jewel. Lord, to give up like me a fool. You are my all in all. Taking my sin, my cross, my shame, rising again, I bless your name. You are my all in all. When I fall down, you pick me up. When I am dry, you fill my cup. You are my all in all. Jesus, Lamb of God, worthy is your name. Jesus, precious Lamb of God, worthy is Jesus, Lamb of God, worthy is your name. Jesus, Lamb of God, worthy is your name. Worthy is your name. Worthy is your
And good afternoon. What a beautiful Monday it is, and I am so thankful that we are able to be with you this afternoon. And I have joining me today Bruce Reeves and Sean Cavender. Guys, y'all all right?
Yeah, we're good.
Doing really
Ready
good.
to go.
Ready to roll, are we?
Yeah.
Well,
Can
what
you
do we?
hear me? Am I close enough here?
Yeah.
The mic. Okay, good.
I can hear you. Everything you do over there, I can hear it. Yep, boom, boom.
You hear that?
Yes, I can. And everybody out there can too. Anyway, we're having too much fun here today, guys. We are wrapping up our studying together on Mondays in preparation for a debate that's coming up here in just a couple of weeks in Amarillo, Texas. Bruce, this guy right here, is going to be debating Holger Neubauer in Amarillo on the AD 70 doctrine. Are you for it or against it?
Well, I'm against that doctrine.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I hope so, because all this time I hope
We've been working for no reason here. No, it'll be a good discussion, and of course you'll be with me like
Yeah.
you always are, and Sean will be there. And
tell us a little bit about it, by the way. So we're going to be talking today, by the way, again about eschatology, the end times, and we're going to be looking a little bit more at the premillennial concept of the end times. And today we're going to be focusing in on the so-called Great Tribulation, the from a premillennial perspective. And we're going to be studying Matthew chapter 24. We'll also go over to Luke 21 and some other passages. Daniel 9 will be brought up today. So we're going to be looking at that. But first, Bruce, tell us a little bit about the debate that's coming up.
Okay. Well, first of all, it's going to be actually held at the Olson Park Church of Christ in Amarillo, Texas. Kyle Pope is the preacher there. And, of course, we all know Kyle very well, very fine brother in Christ and faithful preacher. But he'll be moderating for me. And it's been planned for some time. For those who maybe can't get out to Amarillo, there'll be live streaming through Olson Park Church of Christ, and you can find that on the website pretty easily, or on the web pretty easily. Of course, the doctrine that is taught is that it's often called realized eschatology, and the notion is that there's not yet going to be a future final judgment, a future bodily resurrection, etc. Jesus is not going to come again personally and visibly, that all of that was fulfilled in the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. And I know for a lot of people that seems like a very disorienting thought, because they haven't thought, through that. But anyway, that's what we'll be talking about. And so, of course, I will be arguing that those events have not happened and that they literally will happen.
Had somebody on Facebook last week, I'd sent out an announcement of the debate, and they asked, well, in what way would this doctrine affect our everyday Christian life? In other words, is it worthy of public discussion in this way? And I'll say to you, yeah, absolutely, because what happens is, from studying it now for over a year with you guys, I've come to realize that just about every single passage in our view of the entire New Testament has to be revamped.
Yeah, entire
to
Bible,
fit-
really.
Yeah, the entire Bible. You're right. It all has to be revamped to fit their
Right.
doctrine. And
Well,
So-
Ed Stevens is a kind of a different kind of full preterist than Holger Neubauer, who I'll be having the debate with, or will be having the debate with. But even Ed Stevens says, hey, there's really no part of anything you believe that's not touched by
Yeah.
this. So whether it's the
that's
Everything
true.
is affected by
yeah,
it.
the
And so on
church,
some level.
salvation, on some level, your view of the beginning to the end. And so it'll be an interesting discussion.
And the consequences of the doctrine
yes, and you always
are-
have to look at that. Yeah.
are severe, very
Yes,
severe.
yes.
And I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Yeah. So it'll be a good discussion. I trust that I know Brother Neubauer will represent his position as well as he possibly can, and has done so before. And then, of course, I hope that we will as well. So it'll be good discussion.
Yeah, once again, thank you everyone for joining us today. We've got several who have joined us on Facebook, and if you have a question or a comment, I'd love to hear from you. You can call us at 1-855-568-1062. That's 1-855-568-1062. You can also just paste your question or type in your question or your comment on Facebook. I am following the video on Searching for the Truth page. So if that's the page that you're on, I should be able to see your comments and your questions, and would love to hear from you. All right, guys, what about the second coming of Jesus Christ and the doctrine of the rapture? That's something that I talked about last week. The rapture, Wednesday and Thursday, or Wednesday and Friday, we discussed the rapture doctrine from a premillennial perspective and why the Bible doesn't teach it. And when the rapture supposedly occurs, that's supposed to set in motion what they call the Great Tribulation. 7 years of Great Tribulation. We're going to look at what the Bible has to say. What are the signs of the end? Are there signs we need to be looking for? And does Matthew 24 give us those signs?
Are you talking about the final end?
Yeah, I'm talking about when Jesus comes again. When that last trump sounds,
That'll be it.
that'll be it.
The only
are the-
sign, I guess, will
what are
be
those
Jesus, visibly, personally returning and the world being destroyed. Of course, my conviction, and I think you all as well, I know there's some different discussions about that, but in verse 36 of Matthew 24 and passages like it are describing the final end. He says, but of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven nor the Son, but the Father alone. So all these, those who are trying to predict, well, the passage says, no, it's described as a thief in the night and that kind of thing. There are signs, and there were signs of the tribulation associated with the destruction of Jerusalem. And
Okay.
I think that's where people really get into a problem when they start trying to apply, Matthew 24, 1 through whatever here in this section that are talking about the destruction of Jerusalem to the final end.
Yeah.
So
And as I pointed out last week, when Jesus comes again, it's going to be with a noise, shout, voice of the archangel, the trumpet of God, 1 Thessalonians 4:16. With his holy angels, Matthew 25:31, 2 Thessalonians 1:7 and 8. Suddenly and unexpectedly, as a thief in the night, 1 Thessalonians 5:1 through 4, 2 Peter 3:10, Revelation 22:20. Visibly, Acts 1:9 through 11. As you saw him go into heaven, you will see him come again. That doesn't sound like the secret rapture, nor does it fit the 7-year tribulation idea of all these signs are going to be taking place before this tribulation takes place, according to them. It just doesn't fit what the Bible says. So let's kind of skip over some stuff here. We are aware of all the date setters and all that stuff, but let's just jump right on into some of the text of the Bible. Let's start in Daniel 9. How about that?
Sounds like a good idea.
Begin in Daniel the 9th chapter, because they're talking about the abomination of desolation that is foretold by the prophet Daniel. In Daniel 9, actually Daniel doesn't just mention the phrase or use the expression the abomination of desolation just one time, does he?
No.
I think it's 2 or 3 times in
Three.
the book. Is it 3?
Yeah.
It depends on how you see Daniel 9, but he mentions wings of abomination. That's
Okay,
pretty
yeah.
close. And then abomination of desolation in Daniel 11, which obviously is talking about Antiochus Epiphanes.
Okay.
there. And then there's some discussion about it in Daniel 12. Some say it's about Antiochus Epiphanes. Others say no, it is destruction of Jerusalem. But regardless, it
Right.
is used. It is used 3 times, and I think just about everybody, other than a dispensational premillennialist or something like that, would understand that it can be used in a plurality of ways.
Plurality of ways.
In
Yeah.
Daniel.
I agree with that. That goes along with the hermeneutical principle. Just because a term is used or a phrase is used in different contexts doesn't necessarily mean that it's being used in the same way in every
Yeah.
context.
Yeah, even in the same book.
Right. The context has to determine how the phrase is to be applied. And so it is with Daniel 9. In verse 24, 70 weeks are determined for your people and for your holy city, to finish the transgression, to make an end of sins, to make reconciliation for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. Now, when you think about this passage, okay, your people, who's this written regarding? Who is-
Israel.
Israel, yeah.
And the city. What city is that?
City of Jerusalem.
That's the city of Jerusalem. He goes on, 20 or 70 weeks are determined for your people and for your holy city. And I can't get my computer to move forward here. That's why. Okay, there we go. Verse 25, know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the command to restore and build Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, there shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. The street shall be built again, and the wall even in troublesome times. So, okay, Daniel's not talking about just one day or 1 year. He's talking about a period of time that is going to be elapsing from the time that he writes this prophecy until its ultimate completion. There are several things that are going to be taking place over a period of time, over a period of years, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And so from the going forth of the command to restore and build Jerusalem, what does that refer to?
The time period of Nehemiah and
Okay.
Ezra going back and leading the people, the remnant of Israel, back into Jerusalem to rebuild it and sort of reestablish themselves in the land of in Jerusalem and Judea, and that from the decree of Cyrus in 539 BC, I believe, is when it was, and they went back in 536, and then 516 was when they finally rebuilt the temple complex.
So
We're
from
going to
the-
give you a gold star.
I'm
Man,
telling
I
you.
know. Memorizing those dates.
And Zechariah makes the heart of the message in Zechariah is before the Messiah will come, you all have to go back and do what Sean was talking about, the rebuilding of all of this and being able to reinstitute worship and all of that. This has to happen before that's
Yep.
going to happen.
Okay.
And so all of that kind of
This
I
is
think
going to
figures in.
precede.
Yeah,
This is
yeah.
going to precede
Yeah.
that 69th final week.
Yeah.
Okay. In verse 26, and after the 62 weeks, Messiah shall be cut off, but not for himself. And the people of the prince, who is to come, shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end of it shall be with a flood until the end of the war. Desolations are determined. So you've got after the 62 weeks of the rebuilding of the temple, the reestablishment of worship and everything under the law of Moses. Okay, after all that stuff is established, and this time period has elapsed, the Messiah shall be cut off. What is that reference? Calvary. Yes.
Jesus' death for our sins.
Okay, and he didn't die for himself. Okay, and the people of the prince who is to come. Now, who is the people of the prince that is to come?
It's Rome.
Okay, and they shall destroy the city and the sanctuary.
AD 70.
Yep.
The end of it shall be with a flood. Rome completely overwhelmed
yeah.
and destroyed
Amen.
Jerusalem, including the temple. And just as Jesus says at the beginning of Matthew 24, and we'll get there in a moment, not one stone will be left on top of the other. And the end of it shall be with a flood until the end of the war. Desolations are determined.
You know, Don, this is interesting, that last phrase, until the end of the war, desolations are determined. Because when you look at the destruction of Jerusalem, it didn't happen in 2 months.
No.
You know, it was a long process that
Siege
took,
that
what was
lasted,
it,
I think,
years.
3.5 years or so.
At least. And so there were several years that this was kind of being unraveled and taking place, and finally
In fact, there was even a break.
Yeah, that's right. And there wasn't just one person who was
Right,
part of
Vespasian.
this.
Yeah, you've got Titus eventually coming, of course,
Yeah,
and
he's
leading
the
the
one.
final charge
Yeah.
as the general of the army. But then verse 27, then he shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week he shall bring an end to sacrifice and offering, and on the wing of abominations shall be one who makes desolate. There's the idea, the concept of the abomination of desolation, even until the consummation, which is determined, is poured out on the desolate. So you look at that. Here's a dispensational premillennial chart. I've actually thrown this up a couple of times.
That's scary.
You know,
looking.
from the dispensational view, you know, they'll take this prophecy and even the prophecy of Daniel 2, and what they do is they have to put a break. The prophetic clock has to stop. And then God establishes his plan B, which is the church age, which they say we're in right now. And that's the period, or the age of grace. This period, it's interesting. They don't believe that this period was subject to Old Testament prophecy. You know, I made this comment the other day, guys. I want to ask you what you think about it. Premillennialism, especially dispensational premillennialism, is built upon the premise that God was wrong, that prophecies were wrong.
Yeah, you know, I guess the greatest contradiction is a Calvinist who claims to be a dispensational premillennialist. You know,
those two really don't
fit
together.
One thinks, well, whatsoever shall come to pass has been, you know, foreordained of God, and then you turn around and you go, wait a minute, we've got a contingency plan here.
Yeah.
I think John MacArthur and some like that claim to be premillennialists.
God planned to fail, basically.
Yeah.
Although many Calvinists are not.
Yeah,
premillennial
many of them
for that
are
very
millennial.
reason.
Yeah,
for
that's
that
true.
very reason.
That's true. For this reason, which shows the problem in premillennialism as well, though, because like you said, you have a time issue here when they try to apply it the way that they do. Now, what's also interesting to me, Don, is the fact that, you know, it's not like all dispensational premillennialists agree on the very thing we're talking about. You've got pre-trib, you've got mid-trib, you've got post-trib. I have a friend of mine, and he says, if you really want to see a good religious fight, get a pre-trib, mid-trib, and post-trib guy disagreeing with each other. So that just shows this is very convoluted, I think.
That's very true.
And I think something worth mentioning in what this chart is showing, this graphic here that you're putting up there, is that this what a lot of people do with Daniel 9 is they take these 70 weeks and they try to apply each week as a group of 7 years.
Yeah. And
so then this last week is this supposed 7-year period of time, this 7-year tribulation that people oftentimes talk about. A lot of that is rooted here from Daniel 9, and talking about the prophetic clock that starts and restarts at a later point in time. And I believe what Daniel 9 is speaking about is, and it's prophesying of the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70 by Rome. What a lot of premillennialists, they will say that it's not talking about the Roman Empire, but this revived Roman Empire, which I think is
like Rome.
an empire that was that's like Rome. And I find that interesting that they see the pictures of Rome there, the descriptions that would apply to the Roman
But that
Empire.
can't work
But that
with
can't work
with
with
their
what they
system.
say. Yes.
There's also a problem with when the clock starts.
Yes.
They have different views about that. So
Mhm.
if rather than look at this in a more prophetic, symbolic way, if you're going to force some, literal time on this thing, and we know absolutely, but then you got to stick a big gap in the middle of it.
Kinda
Maybe,
messes up, doesn't it?
yeah, maybe there's something wrong in applying the system.
Maybe Daniel's prophecy was pointing to the destruction of Jerusalem, and it was actually fulfilled, and God did know what he was talking about.
And it wasn't a contingency plan. we're
Right.
talking
It's
about.
Maybe
the
there
plan.
wasn't maybe that was the
that was
Yeah.
the plan. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
then you've got the more prominent, just regular old premillennial view, and their idea, kind of, it's not so much that God made a mistake, although they're very consistent in their application of it, but very close to the dispensational view. Most of the points on that chart that I just had up, premillennialists will generally hold to. But okay, what happens? Daniel's prophecy laid out. You do have 7 sevens. If you want to, and I know people try to pin it down and make it literal, make the time exact. I think you're going to have trouble doing that.
No matter how you
right,
come
That's
out.
right.
When you're talking about a prophetic literature, apocalyptic literature, you do have to make allowances for figurative language. Now, I would agree that there were some general concepts that could be gained from the 7 sevens overall. 62 sevens is a bigger number. 69 sevens is a bigger number. Still, so you've got that. Cyrus's proclamation. Which proclamation was it that Daniel's talking about? Was it Cyrus's in 536 BC? Was it Artaxerxes in 457? Or the second decree of 444-45? I don't know that it matters specifically for the prophecy to work, because again, we're dealing with prophetic numbers and generalizations, not so much exact numbers. But to the Messiah being cut off, that's clearly the cross, right? And then you've got 1-7, the covenant being confirmed. Okay, then the end of sacrifice and offering. The Hebrew writer talks about that at that time that the book of Hebrews was written, the priests were still offering burnt sacrifices at the temple. The Jews were still trying to follow the law in all of its aspects, but when the temple was taken away, that became impossible. Now, let me also just make this side note. Just because the Jews were practicing the law and the sacrifices were still being offered at the temple, does that mean that the law was still in effect?
No.
Okay, I agree. I believe that the law was taken out of the way at the cross. Now, that doesn't mean that people didn't continue to practice it. So the abomination of desolation, 70, all this is 70 AD now, right? And this is where our full preterist would be right in making application to some of these things to AD 70,
Yeah, I don't think we would really. There's an aspect of Daniel 9 we would disagree on.
Yes,
there
is.
And I'm sure we'll talk about that in the debate. But I think that the point being made that this is prophetically showing the end of Israel and the visible removal of Jerusalem as far as the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70 as, again, a visible manifestation of what was already the case.
Right.
The new covenant was already in effect, but that was a visible expression of Christ's reign and his judgment on the unbelieving Jews in the city of Jerusalem.
Matthew 24:15 says, "Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand." Mark's account, and Mark 13 and verse 14. "So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing where it ought not, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains." Luke 21. Whoops, I didn't mean to change that there so quickly. But when you see Jerusalem, now this is interesting. Luke tells us what the abomination of desolation is.
You know, Don, Matthew, and I think most of us understand Matthew has more of a Jewish audience. So he didn't have to do a whole lot of explaining of the abomination of desolation. So they would have said, "Oh, we know what that's talking about."
Yeah.
But if you're talking to a more Gentile audience, it's not uncommon that Luke just comes out and spells things out.
Yeah,
You know,
Matthew and Mark are taking the phrase from
Yeah,
Daniel, and then
contextually.
exactly how Daniel meant it, and then Luke is just telling us exactly what it means.
Right. And so Luke says, to your point, but when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then you know the desolation is near. Well, when did that happen? That happened in AD 70 or in AD 70.
Here's a comment, guys. The premillennialists will say that this time of Jacob's trouble is all about Israel. They will tell you that Israel has not obtained all the land promises that God promised them. It's a very deep and confusing set of beliefs. Like you said, they can't even agree amongst themselves if it's post-trib, mid-trib, pre-trib. They also will say so that will be a newly rebuilt temple in Jerusalem where animal sacrifices will be offered as a memorial to the Lord's Supper. I know for a fact dispensational premillennialism will go so far as to say yes, the chief priests will be, again. I mean, you got all these priests now offering burnt offerings at the temple, at the newly reconstructed temple. You
They
got to
believe
find
that we continue to practice Judaism in the kingdom of Christ.
Some of these guys on TV, or they're reporting, that this heifer has now been found in Jerusalem, or the things are now being put into motion of the rebuilding of the temple, and you see all this talk.
Let me see that, if you don't mind. There was something he said. Oh, land promises.
Yeah, land promises.
Well, and when you go back to Joshua, is it 21:45?
Somewhere in there.
Yeah, in Joshua 21:45, he makes the point that all of the land promise that God promised had been given to them. Now, them continuing in that promise. So it wasn't that God reneged on his promise. He fulfilled everything that he promised. And we can show that from Scripture. But it was conditioned upon them walking in faithfulness. Yeah. And so that's why this happened. Now, eventually, he's going to say through the prophets, I'm going to break you in so many pieces. It's going to be like a glass bottle, basically, that's just
They can't
shattered.
be put back
You
together.
can't put back together. And back to the sacrificial system, which is just, if anything's Judaistic, I mean, a Judaizer could make a better argument than that.
Here's the deal, okay, when it comes to premillennial concepts of what's going to happen, including the reestablishment of the temple and the system and all that. Why go back to a shadow that was foretelling the perfect system that was to come under Christ? Why go back to that type or that shadow when now it's time for the real thing?
How do you read the book of Hebrews or the New Testament?
I don't know. Why go back? And even the 7-year tribulation period that we're talking about, that Jesus himself foretold as far as the tribulation that was coming. Okay, he's talking about this tribulation coming, and the saints are going to be raptured either before, during, or after the tribulation. Well, we're going to go up to heaven for 7 or 3.5 years, or just boom, boom, depending on which view you take. Why come back to this earth? for an earthly stint of 1,000 years.
But this is just a grave misunderstanding of the nature of the kingdom, of the nature of salvation, of all of these problems. Like Ephesians 3:10 and 11 makes the point that the church is the manifestation of the eternal purpose of God.
Yeah.
It's not a contingency plan. And this notion that the kingdom is of this world, when the Lord said it was not of this world, that it ends up denying the full sufficiency of the blood of Christ and the work of the cross and the finished work of the cross. There's just so many aspects of this, but this is always what happens. When you have a system, a kind of pre-planned system based on numbers of misconceptions, and you force it on the text of Scripture, and you're not willing to look at the conclusions it's going to lead you to.
Going back to Luke 21. Thank you, by the way, for the comment.
Yeah, that was a good comment.
But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then you know that its desolation is near. Did that happen?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
Boy, did it.
there's no
Yeah.
question that it happened. It's a record of history. Okay. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains.
Well, and historically, we know the Christians didn't perish in this.
That's what Josephus said.
Mm-hmm.
Let those who are in the midst of her depart, and let not those who are in the country enter her. For these are the days of vengeance, that all things which are written may be fulfilled. Bruce, I want to ask you a question here. Okay. If you don't feel comfortable answering this right now, that's fine.
I don't mind.
I'm going to leave it up to you.
Okay.
All things which are written may be fulfilled. Was everything prophesied in the Bible fulfilled in AD 70 when Rome destroyed Jerusalem? Was everything that God foretold and God promised fulfilled? Was that the realized?
No. I mean,
In
all
the
those
whole
things that had been predicted about this event were
Okay.
fulfilled when that event occurred. But that doesn't mean there's nothing else.
Because Jesus' death on the cross is spoken of as fulfilling all things.
All things which are written. And so that doesn't
And
mean...
the Psalms and the prophets.
Yeah. It's speaking of the fullness of the event under consideration.
All is
Yeah.
unlimited in its context, but
Limited
limited by
by
its
the
context.
context.
There you
And
go.
He's
That's right.
talking about destruction of Jerusalem.
That's right.
Okay, Matthew 23. Let's turn on over to Matthew 23rd chapter. Let's start, not 24, but 23. Beginning in verse 33. Serpents, brood of vipers, how can you escape the condemnation of hell? Therefore, indeed, I send you prophets, wise men, and scribes. Some of them you will kill and crucify, and some of them you will scourge in your synagogues and persecute from city to city, that on you may come all the righteous blood shed on the earth, from the blood of the righteous Abel to the blood of Zachariah, the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. Assuredly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. Now that's chapter 23, and there's the setting, the context setting in context for us Matthew 24. Would y'all agree with that?
Mm-hmm.
What generation is this generation?
It's the generation to which he was speaking. Now, this is where things get really, to me, a little crazy with dispensational premillennialism in general, because they end up saying, no, this is a future generation, and they try to... No, every time Matthew uses that word in this way, and I believe it's at least, maybe it's 5 or 6 times, he's speaking of the generation to which he was speaking. And that's who he's referencing.
Yeah. Verse 37, O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the one who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her, how often I wanted to gather your children together, as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing. See, your house is left to you desolate. There's that concept of desolation again.
But that's Israel.
Yeah.
Your house
Yes.
is being left to you desolate. Yeah.
Yes. And what house did they take the most pride in?
Yeah, the temple.
The temple.
Yeah.
In fact, even the disciples, which we're about to see, they're looking around
They're
and
looking at the
admiring
temple,
all
yeah.
these things. And I think they probably thought, I think the Jewish people probably thought if the temple went, everything was going to go.
Mm-hmm.
As long as the temple stayed, we're good. Even though they should have known their own history better than that.
Even in the days of Jeremiah,
Yeah.
you know, those who opposed the
Yeah.
prophet, they rejected his teaching, his prophecies regarding Nebuchadnezzar's destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, because they felt like, well, this is God's house, this is God's city. God's not going to allow this place to be destroyed. And you know, this is again, this is the Lord Jesus Himself saying, guess what's going to happen to your house, to your city? This is what is going to occur. Now, what's interesting then is time indicators, they're important, right?
They are important.
Yeah.
Yeah,
They just have to be interpreted contextually in a sensitive way.
that is correct. Notice in verse 34 of Matthew 24. This goes along with Matthew 23, what we just mentioned earlier. I asked you what generation was that Jesus is talking about at the end of Matthew 23. Look at verse 34 of 24. Assuredly I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away till all these things take place.
What year was it that Israel became a nation? Again, do you remember?
Oh, you mean
1948?
Yes.
I wanna say
Yes.
I wanted to say 48. To try to take this and say, oh, this generation must be talking about 1948, which a lot of premillennialists have tried to do.
Like this guy.
Oh, look at that. It's
We-
almost like we had that pre-planned. And
We are the generation Jesus was talking about. Now,
Yeah.
wait a minute. 1948. What's a generation?
Approximately 40 years or so,
Okay.
wasn't it?
Now, this was in
Sometimes
1980.
it's not.
20 years.
Okay.
Yeah.
This is Hal Lindsey in 1980. Okay. The countdown to Armageddon on page 162. We are the generation Jesus was talking about. I say that because unmistakably, for the first time in history, all the signs are coming together at an accelerating rate. Now, that was in 1980. Okay.
Yeah,
40
somebody hit the brakes, man. So,
40 years, the prophetic clock. Stop again.
yeah, I
40
forgot.
years,
Took the
okay, from
batteries out.
1948. Okay, you go from
Had to wind it
1948
back
to 1988. That would have been a generation. So, okay, if it was going to happen in that generation, it would have already happened.
You know, the thing is, obviously, whatever years you put on a generation, I think it can vary from text to text. But here's the thing: is if he's talking to this generation, and we're talking about, the things he had been saying about the destruction of Jerusalem, that makes sense. Okay.
Yeah.
There's no way the premillennial view fairly defines these notions or these concepts without having to do damage to them in order to hold up the system.
Yeah.
There's just no way.
Vines defines the term generation this way: that which has been begotten, a family or successive members of a genealogy or of a race of people possessed of similar characteristics of the whole multitude of men living at the same time. Matthew 24:34, especially of those of the Jewish race living at the same period. Okay, then notice down there at the end, 30 or 40 years. Okay, so 80-70 was within that time frame. 1948 was not. So, okay. Notice some other examples of this. Mark 8 and verse 12. But he sighed deeply in his spirit and said, why does this generation seek a sign? What generation was he talking about?
1948.
Assuredly, I say
No,
to you,
I'm
no
teasing.
sign shall be given to this generation. What generation was Jesus talking
the
about?
people to whom he's speaking.
Luke 11 and verse 50, that the blood of all the prophets which was shed from the foundation of the world may be required of this generation, 1948. From the blood of Abel to the blood of Zechariah, who perished between the altar and the temple, yes, I say to you, it shall be required of this generation. Luke 17:25, but first you must suffer many things and be rejected by this generation. So again, you compare Matthew 24:33, 34, Mark 13:29, 30, Luke 21:31, 32. These are all parallel accounts of this prophecy of the destruction of Jerusalem. this generation is mentioned in all three of them, and it has the same application in every passage. It's talking about that generation. Now, I think that's very important to properly understand Matthew 24. Now, if you apply this generation to, if Jesus had said these things, are going to happen, and he doesn't give us that time indicator of this generation, well, okay, you may have some arguments that could be made, but this, to me, it nails it down.
Yeah, and in addition to that, to go along with that contextually, and I may be getting ahead of you, I don't know, but when you go back in Matthew 24 and you look at the advice he gives them, the counsel he gives them about how to handle what he's speaking of, in verse 15, we've already shown, at the very least, some of those references in Daniel, and I think most non-premillennialists would agree, Daniel now speaking of the destruction of Jerusalem. Verse 16, we talked about those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. Look down in verse 19. But woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days. Verse 20. But pray that your flight will not be in the winter or on the Sabbath. And we could go on and talk about some other things, but my point is, now sometimes, I will make this point, apocalyptic language can be used that sounds as though it's the very final judgment, but some of the judgment on a nation or a city, okay? So you have to take that into consideration. However, some of this language is unique to the destruction of Jerusalem and would not apply to the coming of the Lord in the twinkling of an eye.
Right.
And not only that, but in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, he makes the point that when Christ comes again, then comes the end. Well, that's not the premillennial view. No. You have this secret rapture, and like you said, you got 7 years of tribulation, 1,000.
They believe that when Jesus comes again, that's going to be the beginning.
Yeah, and it says it'll be the end. Very clear. And so I think if you just took all this into consideration in the proper context, there's just no way premillennialism.
Notice in verse 16, let those who are in Judea. In fact, let me go back here to the charts, and I want you to notice something. To whom is Jesus talking to? When he says you, who is he talking to? Go back up at the first part of the chapter. Notice
to his disciples, actually.
Yes. Then Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came up to show him the building of the temple. And Jesus said to them, do you not see all these things? And surely I say to you, not one stone shall be left here upon another that shall not be thrown down. He's talking to his disciples. He's telling them what's going to happen to this city, right? To you. And this is over and over and over throughout this text. He talks about false Christs that are going to come. We find in the scriptures and other places, for example, in Acts 5 and verse 36, Theudas, and also chapter 8 verse 9, Simon the sorcerer. You've got these false Christs, and you've got these folks teaching error. Wars and rumors of war, natural disasters, persecutions, betrayals. All these things Jesus says is going to happen. Notice some historical records here. This is from Tacitus. Histories. The history on which I am entering is that of a period which rich in disasters, terrible with battles, torn by civil struggles, horrible even in peace. 4 emperors fell by the sword. There were 3 civil wars, more foreign wars, and often both at the same time. Now, that's what a man who was living just before 70 AD, AD 70, he's seeing all these things happening. He records them. Who was Tacitus?
Is that Tacitus?
Tacitus.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. He was just a historian, wasn't he?
Yes.
Yeah.
And you've got Josephus. Who was Josephus?
Jewish historian.
He's a Jewish historian working for the Roman government,
That's
actually.
a good point.
Now her coming was of a very great advantage to the people of Jerusalem, for whereas a famine did oppress them at that time, and many people died for want of what was necessary to produce food. Withal, Queen Helena sent some of her servants to Alexandria with money to buy a great quantity of corn, and others to Cyprus to bring a cargo of dried figs. You had famines in Jerusalem, in Judea. Again, Tacitus, many prodigies occurred during the year. Ominous birds took their seat on the Capitol houses, were overturned by repeated shocks of earthquakes, and at the panic spread, the weak were trampled underfoot in the trepidation of the crowd. A shortage of corn again, and the famine which resulted were construed as a supernatural warning. Written, in view of the things that were going on just before Rome destroyed Jerusalem.
By the way, it is interesting to note, he says this is the beginning of a process.
Yes.
It's the beginning of the birth pains. It's not the end.
Right.
He said, in fact, he makes the point there in verse 8, but all these things are merely the beginning of birth pains.
Yeah.
So it's not completed yet, so it takes a while.
Notice here's J. Marcellus Kick.
Good book, by the way.
And as to earthquakes, many are mentioned by writers during a period just previous to AD 70 or 70 AD. There were earthquakes in Crete, Smyrna, Miletus, Chios, Samos, Laodicea, Hierapolis, Colossae, Campania. You got Rome, Judea, all these. That's a lot of earthquakes. It is interesting to note that the city of Pompeii was much damaged by an earthquake occurring on February 5th, 63 AD. So you just got, over and over and over again, all these signs, that Jesus is pointing to. Jesus also says in verse 14 of Matthew 24 that the gospel of the kingdom would be preached. Now, that's one of the interesting things I hear oftentimes as an argument say, well, see, this hasn't been fulfilled yet. Matthew 24 has not been fulfilled yet because the gospel hasn't been preached throughout the world yet. That's not what Paul says in Colossians 1 verse 6 and verse 23. He says that the gospel had gone forth throughout the whole world. Had it or had it not? Had the gospel been proclaimed to the whole world?
It had been preached to every creature, Jew and Gentile.
It had been preached to Jew and Gentile.
In fact, I'll tell you what, let me pull that up.
I think sometimes people misunderstand the point, though. I don't personally think it means every human being on the planet had heard
Right.
the gospel. Your phone's ringing, but I think.
Not anymore.
All right. I think the point is the known world, the gospel
Yeah.
had been proclaimed, and that Jew and Gentile were going to hear the gospel. And even when you begin to see who the gospel was for, and so to me that's what when he says the gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world as a testimony, listen, to all the nations. So it seems to me what he's saying is the gospel is going to be preached to the Gentiles before this happens, before this occurs.
Okay, we got another comment here. We'll look at this here in just a moment. Pretty long. So, someone's interpretation, how they read Luke 21. We'll get there in just a minute, so hold on. Notice there in Colossians 1 verse 6, which has come to you as it has also in all the world and is bringing forth fruit. What has come to them?
The gospel.
The gospel, right?
But
The hope, the
Yes.
word of truth of the gospel.
But the gospel was still going to be expanded. And by the way,
Sure.
more and more people were going to hear about the gospel. But it is true, the destruction of Jerusalem was not going to happen before the gospel had been proclaimed to Jews and Gentiles.
Verse 23, if indeed you continue in the faith, grounded and steadfast, and are not moved away from the hope of the gospel which you heard, which was preached to every creature under heaven.
Okay, but let me push back just a little bit. What would you say? I mean, I think you and I know we're on the same page, but when he says preach to every creature under heaven, does that mean every human being?
It means every dog, cat, turtle, snake, fish.
I mean, I think,
No.
obviously it's for every human being, and they're preaching the gospel, but clearly it is Jew and Gentile
Look,
that are going to hear the gospel.
The
before
gospel had
87.
gone throughout Asia. The gospel
Yeah,
had gone
that's right.
throughout the Roman Empire.
Mhm.
Okay, it had reached to every
The known
end of the
world.
known.
Yeah.
It had been preached everywhere that men were living at that time.
Yeah.
Okay, And I mean, even though Paul had not personally been to Rome, guess what? There was a church in Rome.
That's right. That's right.
And the gospel went forth from the. I mean, the gospel. Paul even tells the church in Thessalonica that, the gospel had gone forth from them. That they didn't even have, the apostles didn't even have to say anything because the church in Thessalonica was preaching the gospel, and that's what happened. The gospel went everywhere throughout the known world. You even have an Ethiopian that was converted in Acts chapter 8. And what do you think he did when he got back home?
Right.
Yeah.
So you've got that truth. So listen, when Jesus says the gospel of the kingdom will be preached throughout the world, well, that's what he meant, and that happened. That occurred before AD 70, and you've got Daniel 9:27 again, the abomination of desolation. Okay, Luke 20 through 24, verse 24. I had Luke 20 through 24. That was the wrong passage there. But Jesus gave the Olivet Discourse in about 30 A.D. Jerusalem was destroyed by Titus, the Roman general, in 70 A.D. So all of that fits. And you've got the wars of the Jews. There are some more interesting quotes. Another one by Josephus, talking about the abominations that came upon the house of God, which was the temple. Okay, the sacred places that ought not be trodden upon at random, filled with the feet of these blood-shedding villains. That was Josephus seeing the abomination of the temple. And this is more to your point, Bruce, that you were making a few moments ago. Those in Judea were to flee. Those on the housetop were to flee. Don't go back into the house and get what and if you're in the field, don't go back to your house and get what is left. The pregnant, woe unto those who are pregnant in those days. Pray that your flight may not be in the winter or on the Sabbath. Why would it? What would be the deal with it being on the Sabbath day? Why would Jesus say
The
pray?
day of rest, that it was a holy day they were to.
It would be difficult. Difficult.
It would be difficult for them. Another thing is, of course, there was no interest in it. I mean, the city gates would be
That's
closed.
what I mean. It'd be
People
hard.
would be
Wouldn't
trapped.
be able to get out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what is interesting in all these descriptions is that while this is described as a tribulation, and as your chart says it's a local tribulation, it is also a tribulation that they were warned about so that they could try to escape here. And that's why Jesus is trying to warn them about it and giving this prophecy. But
Right.
premillennialists, those who might try to apply this to the end of the world or this great tribulation, that's a tribulation that is going to happen, I think, according to their doctrine, their teaching, that you're not going to be able to escape it unless you're
Yeah, it's
those who are
Why
raptured.
would you go somewhere else?
Right.
Yeah, that's right. Something else is some of the language in Matthew 24, they're just figures that are trying to get across. You need to be ready. Okay. But then, like I mentioned, then some of the language, talking about being, being pregnant and the Sabbath and all of those in Judea flee, this so explicitly seems to be referring to the destruction of Jerusalem in that section.
Here's the main point. All of these signs that they were to look for and be prepared for was an indication of the fact that this tribulation, this abomination of desolation could be escaped.
Mm-hmm.
And Bruce, you mentioned earlier, how many Christians died in the destruction of Jerusalem?
Historically, I think we're
According to
getting the impression
Josephus,
none of them.
yeah, according to Josephus, none died. Now I don't know, that's just a historical record, a historian making that point from his perspective. None died. But let me read this quote, this comment one of our listeners left on Luke 21. It says it describes two events. Verses 20 through 24 clearly pertains to the destruction of Jerusalem, whereas verses 25 through 28 describe events prior to Jesus' second coming. Why do I believe this? Verses 25 and 26 says, and there will be signs in the sun and the moon and the stars and the earth distress, and on the earth distress of nations with perplexity, the sea and the waves roaring, men's hearts failing them from fear and the expectation of those things which are coming on the earth, These are events that affect the earth and the nations and men's hearts, failing them from fear of the things which are coming on the earth. These signs are real and cannot be considered figurative to the fall of Jerusalem. The irreversible melting of the polar caps will no doubt cause the seas to roar, climate to go haywire, and pestilences of all kinds to occur. All men will be in anguish. Jesus cannot be referring to the fall of the Jewish system in AD 70 because that event had nothing to do with your redemption drawing near. Verse 28. Anyway, that's how I read and interpret Luke 21. Guys, comments?
Okay, I've got a few thoughts. There are some that are amillennial, they're not premillennial, who would argue, okay, that language may be referring to that it's kind of, and this isn't necessarily my position, I'm just sharing.
Okay.
That it's kind of like this is not that. Okay, and that does happen sometimes, but they'll argue this is not that. So they'll say there's two events. So he's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, but then he comes back and says, "But look at this, it's the final coming." The other argument would be, even for those who don't see all of Matthew 24 as referring to the destruction of Jerusalem, because they see a transition that takes place down there around verse 36 or so, 34, after verse 34. The other point would be, before you're too quick about this language, like even if I take Matthew 24, 29 through 31, let's look at 29. But immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from the sky, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. There is plenty of language in the Old Testament that's it's cosmic language, it's cataclysmic language, where these figures are used for the downfall of a nation or a city when it's coming from God's judgment. You can see even the Lord coming on the clouds used in an apocalyptic way in Isaiah. Right. Now, so is it possible that the language the writer there refers to, in a context of talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, that this was going to have such a large effect in the Jewish mind, that it would be as if his world was coming to an end? Yes. Okay. However, let me say this, that even in these figures of speech, when they are used figuratively, even in Isaiah or whatever, figures are rooted in a reality. And I believe that even those figures, even if we say, hey, this is talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, or this is talking about the fall of Babylon, or whatever, the figures themselves are rooted in a reality that literally will happen at the end.
And certainly those figures are not exhausted in the destruction of Jerusalem.
They may apply to the destruction of Jerusalem in this context, but the language is not exhausted by the destruction of Jerusalem.
For example, and just to your point, this language that we see in Matthew 24, let me go back and notice it says, beginning in verse 29, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from heaven, the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Okay, compare that to Babylon. The fall of Babylon is prophesied by Isaiah in Isaiah 13, verses 10 and verse 13. He uses the same language, and that's referring to the fall of Babylon. You have the fall of Edom prophesied by Isaiah in Isaiah 34, verses 4 through 6. You have similar language. Okay.
Let me just read a couple of these. Don, have you got the verses coming? Or
no, I don't.
Just so people will understand, like verse 4 about God's wrath against these nations, and all the hosts of heaven will wear away, and the sky will be rolled up like a scroll, and all their hosts will also wither away, and the leaf withers from the vine. My sword is satiated in heaven. Behold, it shall descend for judgment upon Edom and upon the people whom I have devoted to destruction, etc. So it's that kind of language you're going to see throughout all of these. Now, I would say if that is not ever literally going to happen, those figures don't work.
Notice Isaiah chapter 34, verse 4. All the hosts of heaven shall be dissolved, and the heavens shall be rolled up like a scroll, and their hosts shall fall down as the leaf falls from the vine. Yeah, you just read that.
Yeah, you're right. But you're right, Don. When you look at that, if I didn't know the context, if I just saw the figure, I might think, well, that's the final end. But the reason it sounds that way, and this is the point you're making, the reason it sounds that way is because it's a figure, but the figure's rooted in reality. And when you look at all that you've got on that slide, I think that makes the point that is it justifiable for that to be used, to your writer's question? Yeah.
Yeah, and the seas and all the turbulence and everything. Well, that's the agitation that's going on in the world. The peoples are all upset, and you got the fighting, the wars, and all the things that are taking place. That's apocryphal language. That's referencing
Apocalyptic
language. Yeah, that's referencing the destruction of a people and their rulers falling from their positions of power and authority, and the overturning of that system.
Now, that doesn't deny there will be a final judgment that will
That's exactly right, and I agree wholeheartedly with that. In fact, there are things that Jesus is using here that clearly point to, I believe, pointing to the eventual
that's a good point.
end. But I
Not
believe in the
everything.
context, he's applying it to this event, and he's using this language to express the tumult that's going to be taking place during these trying times.
But even if you took that part of what the writer was saying, that doesn't necessarily point you toward dispensational premillennialism.
Right.
I mean, there's
Right.
some room there for discussion. I
Sure,
think.
sure. What about this? This is going to be the greatest tribulation of all time. That's another argument that premillennialists will use. Well, this hasn't happened. There have been other atrocities that's happened that exceed the destruction of Jerusalem as far as calamity is concerned.
Well,
Aren't there?
Well, let me back up. It's a proverbial expression, first of all, that, nothing is ever going to happen like this. That is also used, and I'm trying to remember the passage, I think that was also used of Babylon, that nothing that you've ever seen or ever will see will be like this. Well, it doesn't mean there can never be anything in numbers that exceeds this. But now the significance of the event is great. I think that's all he means, whether he's talking about Babylon. I mean, because it was hard for those people. You think about if you lived in Babylon, the thought that Babylon would not be, or that Nebuchadnezzar wasn't going to be in power. Well, that's a tough one. And the same would be true for the Jewish people when they thought of Jerusalem. They couldn't imagine Jerusalem not existing. So, Jesus uses that language. It's a proverbial phrase.
Over 1 million Jews died in the destruction of Jerusalem. Think about that as far as percentage as per capita, from that perspective. I mean, that's
a lot.
Wow. Thousands more were killed outside of the city and in other cities in Judea. Over 97,000 were carried away captive. That is
Significant.
That's significant. Yeah, that's
And-
remarkable.
And for the Jew, and I think this is a fair point, for the Jews trying to hang on to things like they used to be.
Wow.
Yeah, I know we're almost.
I just
there.
looked at the clock.
We're past time. But for the Jews trying to hang on to things the way they used to be, that's going to visibly make it clear that's just not how they are anymore.
So we can wind up right
Okay.
here. Again, Matthew 24:33 through 34. Listen, this is what, and Luke 21:31 through 32, going back to our viewer's comment. Notice this generation again. Now it is true, and I agree that there may be this, that, and there's a contrast and comparison, whether it be in Matthew's account, there is a comparison. These are signs that are leading up to the destruction of Jerusalem, but this is what's going to happen when Jesus comes again. But now all these signs that I've told you, all this is going to take place in this generation.
That's right.
So I think, like you said, there is some leeway for that interpretation. However,
You can't
here's
get
the
out
point.
of that. Yeah.
The signs of Matthew 24 are pointing to the destruction of Jerusalem, not some future 7-year tribulation period.
That's right.
I think that's pretty clear. When you see all these things, Jesus says, Know that it is near at the doors. Assuredly, I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away till all these things take place. So when you hear your preacher stand up and say, well, the end is coming because look here in Matthew 24, all these signs, you see all these things taking place. So, rumors of wars. You see the famine and pestilences. You see the earthquakes. Every time we have an earthquake, we got preachers getting up saying, "Oh, the time is now." They're misunderstanding and misapplying Matthew 24.
Mm-hmm.
So, guys, thank you.
Thanks, Todd.
Had one more.
Enjoyed it.
If you had the literal melting of the polar ice caps, there would be no Earth left. Yeah, that's true.
Okay.
All right. Well, appreciate everyone being with us today, and Lord willing, we'll be back Wednesday at 3:00. Now, we're going to have a technician coming in on Wednesday to work on our internet. We've been having some issues. They're going to come in and make the corrections and upgrade our system Wednesday, and hopefully everything will be set and ready to go by 3:00. We may be a little late, but just FYI. Thank you guys for being with us. Thanks everyone for joining us today. Lord willing, we'll be back Wednesday afternoon at 3:00. Until then, may God bless you, and I hope and pray that you have a great, great rest of the day.
How can it be the one who died has borne our sin through sacrifice to conquer every sting of death? Sing hallelujah, for joy awaits as dawning light when Christ's disciples lift their eyes. Alive he stands, their friend and King. Christ he is risen. Christ is risen, he is risen indeed. Oh, sing hallelujah. Join the chorus, sing with the redeemed. Christ is risen, he is risen indeed. Where doubt and darkness once had been, they saw him and their hearts believed. But blessed are those who have not seen, yet sing hallelujah. Once bound by fear, now bold in faith, they preach the truth and power of grace, and pouring out their lives they gain life everlasting. Christ is risen, he is risen indeed. Oh, sing hallelujah. Join the chorus, sing with the redeemed. Christ is risen, he is risen indeed. The power that raised him from the grave now works in us to powerfully save. He frees our hearts to live his grace. Go, tell of his goodness. Christ is risen, he is risen indeed. Oh, sing hallelujah. Join the chorus, sing with the redeemed. Christ is risen.